Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 535. I just went backwards in time 4 years, Mason.
Yeah, well, it's a long time ago, but hey, it's not a long time ago since Standard was great, as we're in the middle of it right now.
Dude, I think Standard is great, and we are going to talk about Standard rules of engagement today. So I want to give a shout out to Abe, who's not joining us today. Hope you're doing well, Abe. Nothing's wrong. Abe just, we're recording early. Abe's got other stuff he can be doing. He's doing some personal stuff, and yeah, it's just me and Mason today, so. But we're going to dive right into the standard rules of engagement today. We're not going to, jump around. Before we do that, Mason, we did an episode in episode 511 on what are rules of engagement, but just kind of like high level. What does this topic mean for people that maybe aren't familiar with the concept?
Yeah, so like rules of engagement are kind of like almost like heuristics or kind of like bullet points to think about when thinking about the format and things that kind of happen in it. So like a good example of this from a format lots of people play Modern would be like a rule of engagement is the interaction is going to be cheap and punishing, right? So you're going to see a lot of one mana spells that are going to be high tempo plays, and your cards need to be resilient to those one mana interactive spells, right? So that would be a thing that you kind of know. And then with that, that might help guide you on your journey through the format. So think of this kind of like a cheat sheet or like a way to like start thinking about the format and heuristics. And, sort of the way we lay this out and talk about that is that, and it's going to lead kind of into a flowing conversation. We know standard RCQ season is really starting to kick off right now. And we're about 4 weeks away from the Spotlight series, which I'm very excited for. The first GP back in Atlanta in January. You'll see me there if you want to hang out. But Standard's really big right now, and there's a lot of interesting, exciting things going on with a pretty wide format. So we're going to kind of cover that today, and that's sort of what you can expect from rules of engagement.
Yeah, let's start with the first one, which is actions, but not action economy. That's what I've written down here. This is something we talked about a couple weeks ago when we did our standard check-in. But basically, there are decks that punish you for not taking actions in this format, but it's not an action economy format. But what this means is, like, when you are looking at your opening hand, Mason, you have to decide, like in the blind, you have to be prepared to take actions or accept the consequences if you're not going to do it.
Yeah, and you're kind of seeing that in a lot of the decks, right? Like, blue-white control is not, and just in general, traditional control is not super prevalent in the metagame. Sitting there with counterspells up and kind of sitting around, we don't have some cards that close as well, and decks are really good at sort of getting a few things down and writing those few things. Hired Claw really jumps out to me as a card that excels with this. Same with kind of the Rockface Village with that deck as well with Mono Red, where they have ways to use their mana and they have ways to kind of do things every turn, even if they're not having a flurry of spells. And that's what we mean by like action economy is like you're measuring your strength by how much you're doing something, but you need to be able to take actions. And there's lots of ways to do it. You're not forced to be kind of like all low spells, very cheap, like you might be in other formats or other, healthy versions of metagames. This one is something where you need to be doing a thing and constantly. And you can forego it for like maybe a turn or two, but if you skip like 2 or 3 turns in a row, it's typically lights out. Like it is, I kind of feel very similar, right? Like if I'm not doing something starting turn 2, I feel like I'm kind of, like missing the boat, right? Like I'm kind of down to skip turn 1 if I have like a strong hand, but I do kind of want to have decks that go like 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's there are it's a deck, it's a format where like Llanowar exists for some decks. It's a format where Heartfire Hero exists as well. I mean, let's be honest, the number of good red 1-drops, like you see decks playing 4 Lizards, 4 Heartfire Heroes, 2 is it Kelran or
I haven't seen as much Kellen recently. I've seen a lot of people kind of move in, but there was a lot of Kellen.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Spear.
Yeah, so and Swift Spears going on. Like,
yeah,
that's. I mean, that the people could literally play like, 14, or like 1-drops if they wanted to, and some people have done it, like just actual red aggro type of stuff, and that's not even to get into like the fact that other colors also can play an aggressive style of game. Whether it's green, they have you could play, aggressively slanted green decks. You can play aggressively slanted white decks. There's a lot kind of going on that edge, which means kind of forces decks into playing cheap removal, which means that things that circumvent that, and that's what I mean. Where it's like it's an action format, but it's not an action economy format. Where because of the limitations of the things going on, it doesn't force you into just like whoever takes the most actions wins. It actually has to do with like making sure that you're sequencing and lining things up correctly. But I want to get into what you said earlier, because you kind of talked about like how those actions result into something, and that's because this format is pretty snowbally. Like, once you gain an advantage, you really want to try to keep it.
Yeah, a lot of the decks, like you're mentioning there, have like really lowish curves because of like, we have powerful interaction, and cards like Llanowar Elf and the mono red deck really put a lot of pressure on you, right? Like we're not really seeing Llanowar Elf create this as much because there's a lot of like struggling to maximize that card at the moment, but also like the red deck is kind of doing it in a more prevalent way. But basically, if you kind of skip turn 1, turn 2, imagine your opponent goes, Emberheart Hero into Manifold Mouse into, Double Strike my guy, hit you for 4. You play a 3-drop, and I monster straight my mouse, right? I'm hitting you for 14 damage if you don't block. That's obviously like an almost insurmountable amount of damage. So there's a lot of emphasis on kind of constricting our things early, and then the other decks actually do a very similar thing. Some of the other best decks are like the black mid-range decks. We talked about Llanowar Elf there, Golgari. We can look at Dimir, which is really Golgari as the main black deck. We're seeing like Kaito kind of run away with games. We're seeing Enduring Curiosity do the same. We're even seeing players like experiment with playing some more Gix to kind of have more of that. So we're seeing a lot of action and snowballing happening, and that's why you need to be able to get on the board. We need to be able to interact in some way early, because those cards will win the game on their own. And if they just cast like, you get a Kaito down early, you hold up a Spyglass Siren with it maybe, and you're just like pecking on your opponent and you're not doing anything, they don't have to do anything else either, right? They're going to win with just those cards. It's going to become harder and harder to catch up, and that's assuming they do nothing else.
Yeah, if you would ask me like last year what I thought the best card in Standard was, I would have said that it was why is my brain doing
The Wandering Emperor?
No.
Oh, that's crazy.
Good call though. Good call.
I think actually, while Spencer's thinking about this really quickly here, while you're getting your thoughts together, Spencer, the Wandering Emperor is a good example of like you need like a card that would create an action and force the game around itself, but it would stabilize you for not doing as much, right? You like commit to the board, it comes down, it trades off typically with your best threat, and then it would create like a chump blocker, or it would be kind of protected and it would start creating an army. So that's kind of a card that can stabilize you. We saw similar things with like kind of the squeeze with Memory Deluge for a long time. We don't have those punishing cards from blue-white currently, so that's sort of leading to like why you're seeing less of that. So that side's over, Spencer, what are we thinking about?
I was thinking about Deep Cavern Bat and like it just like its disruption on the format, but it's really hard to play like a 2-mana 1/1 in this form. Like it just doesn't work. It doesn't function because the decks are so streamlined for that snowballing effect that the disruption doesn't impact them the way that you want it to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because listeners might be hearing this and might be thinking like, what do you mean Deep Cavern Bat's not that? They might be taken aback a bit, right? It is like before this New Foundations era of Magic, it was definitely considered one of the better cards, and it's still really good. Like if your opponent plays Deep Cavern Bat, it's not like it's a 0, and it seems like it would be serving that snowball nature, right? I get on board early, I bat you, I take the one thing you kind of wanted, right? I kind of throw your curve off, and now I'm snowballing. But the way the format is sort of with all the cheap interaction and sort of the nature of those black decks, it isn't as good. So like that's a card, for example, I think has been awful in Golgari for the whole time and is situationally good in Dimir, because Dimir is sort of playing a different style of game than Golgari is, right?
So you're just like sprinkling in a hot take there. I love that. That's great.
What I mean, Golgari and Bat just doesn't really make much sense together, right? But yeah, like I think it is something where it's like you're right, like Bat is kind of fallen off its pedestal a bit, and that's an interesting thing we've been seeing from the Moto challenges, right? A lot of the standard challenge players, some of them have been kind of experimenting with, hey, can I cut Bat? Can I not? And that's like a very interesting place that we're ending up because of the snowball, like Spencer's talking about. Even though Bat can play a part of that, some players aren't wanting to play those kind of games, and Bat can sometimes be a little bit of a liability when you're maybe trying to play a cheaper, lower the ground game and maximize cards like, let's say, Kaito Shizuki.
Yeah, I think that like there are times I really like what you said about the blue-black deck too, where like like there are versions of the blue-black deck that like Bat makes a ton of sense in but that's because the advantage that you're trying to push is like these dorky little things and Curiosity and Kaido. And then there are versions where it's like in like Demons where it's like this doesn't make any sense. Like there's no reason to play this. And I think that's a sharp departure from where Standard was, not just pre-Foundations, but like where there was a time where I literally thought Deep Cavern Bat was the best card in Standard for Standard.
Sure, yeah, and I think one of the things we're seeing too that like leads to that is the rise of efficient 1-mana removal, right? If you look back a year ago, what was the best 1-mana kill spell in Standard? It was Cut Down. Now, fast forward a year, you could argue Cut Down is still the best 1-mana kill spell. I think you could also argue that Burst Lightning is one of the best 1-mana kill spells, right? And that simple nature of doubling the number of 1-mana interaction has huge implications, especially when it's spread across different colors, right? If let's pretend Burst Lightning was a black card, we might not be seeing the same implications we are now. But now that two different colors kind of have access to this cheap, good interaction that you want to play, that makes it, playing cards of higher mana values harder. If you look back to sort of my example of what's a rule of engagement in Modern, right? We kind of highlighted this. Cheap answers are going to punish threats that do not immediately have an impact, that can sort of counteract that 1 or 0 mana nature. Obviously, Standard doesn't have 0 mana spells, but our 1 and 2 mana removal is so strong right now. It's all conditional, but it's strong, and that really changes what things are about. So I really like kind of that dynamic of things, and it's really important to highlight. So I'm glad you sort of brought up Deep Cavern Bat, because I do think it's an example of something that like you can tell a lot about your opponent's deck if they go like Swamp, Verge, Bat. You know how like different their deck is from someone else who isn't doing that, and that's super cool. Yeah,
I just want to shout out like, it's not just the like those two, like there are decks that literally go bend over backwards just to play laydown arms because of how important this is.
I forgot about that one. That's actually a perfect example too of how different it all is.
Yeah.
So
we kind of talked about pushing your advantage. I want to talk about Breaking Serve. This is one that Abe had sent to us that when making the show notes, and it was interesting because before the show, Mason, I was telling you like I don't think decks are good at this. Like I think that like because of how snowbally and how important pushing your advantage is, decks are really built to do that. And so the way to break serve, in my opinion, is knowing that that you're going to be on the back foot, and then preparing to do it at some point in the game. And it has to do with like utilizing your cards in the right way. I want to give an example of this that I misplayed yesterday, where I had a Torch and a Burst Lightning in the Mouse Mirror, and I had a Monstrous Rage. And my opponent played, I don't remember if they had played a Heartfire hero or something, but basically I had to decide whether I wanted to Burst or Torch it, and I decided to Torch it, the person I was playing with, Patty B, patron of the show, was like, I wonder if we're supposed to Burst here. And because I was thinking, like, I'm going to push my advantage and deal damage. Well, it turned out that, like, the Monstrous Rage roll token would have served me better as a sacrifice for the Torch. And, like, that's a way to break serve that's, like, not typical. Where you have to find a way to do it in spots where you don't expect it, in addition to the fact that, like, because things aren't always going to go your way, you have to find ways to utilize your cards to do it. Where the break serve here is, okay, they're going to have another thing that I want to torch. So I might as well use the burst while I can and not assume that it's going to get in the last points of damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also like Torch has a lot of implications as the game goes long too with Emberheart. Yeah, I'm sorry, Fireheart Challenger, right? So like that, definitely makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, and I think that is a big part of the format in general. It's kind of making sure you line up your stuff correctly, which I think kind of leads towards your actions that we talked about earlier and how important they are. And I think this idea of breaking serve, you can kind of tie it into the first two things we talked about. So first, one of the best ways to break serve is to make sure you have the potential to snowball, right? Like, what is breaking serve if not starting your own snowball? You could argue it's that. So making sure that you have hands that are functional, that you're not keeping just kind of pile hands. So if your opponent maybe keeps a greedier one or gets a little unlucky and draws one too many lands and you were on the back foot, now you're catching up. That's a great way. And the other way, I think, is honestly just the way you sequence. Like, I've brought this up with people a lot, that a lot of standard decks do not have a lot of cards that can solo you, right? When you play older formats, like a lot of people have been playing a lot of Pioneer, a lot of Modern for RCQ season, they get into this, like, I have to kill everything mode because all of the cards' power level is so much higher, right? Every threat can finish the game. A great example of this is kind of Mosswood Dread Knight in Standard. Mosswood Dread Knight is a pretty annoying card. It is most likely not going to solo you, though. It's a 3/2. It provides a lot of advantage at times. It's very frustrating, but it's not a card you need to be like, I have to anoint with Affliction Mosswood Dread Knight. You can afford to let that hit you, maybe develop on your board a little bit, and then save that anoint for something like the Glissa, like the Preacher. And thinking about, okay, where can I use my actions and where can I stop their snowball and break that serve is so, so important. It isn't easy to do, right? Like Spencer said, a lot of people are trying to snowball in these standard formats. And if your opponent kind of, keeps having it and they're hitting their curve perfectly, it's going to be hard to do. But it is doable if you're playing mindfully with it and you look for those opportunities, right? It's a lot like playing poker. You might not, hit your hand or whatever, but you're going to play to hit those outs and win the games you can that way.
Yeah, it kind of comes down to, I actually really like the poker comparison for this standard format because it's about pushing when you're advantaged, and it's about finding opportunities to gain an advantage when you're not. I like that comparison a lot. And I think that, like, the reason that this isn't an action economy format is because the actions have to just be impactful rather than just take act, like just use all your mana every turn, do everything you can. No, it is actually, like, important that the thing that you're doing is contributing to that snowballing effect. So it isn't just like use all your mana every turn, you're gonna win. With that being said, we've talked about this a little bit, but like mana efficiency is like a rule of engagement in this format that I don't know that it pushes out some decks that like would be really cool otherwise. But the importance of being able to both be mana efficient due to the mana efficiency of both the red deck and, in all honesty, how lean the mid-range decks are, really comes down to, like, okay, I have to get the most out of my cards, and I need to get the most out of my mana because of that. And the larger the card pool is, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, really dictates, like, what you're allowed to do. Like, what you're allowed to, like, put in your deck as far as stuff. Today I played against somebody who was playing a Gruul Surprise deck, and they had Solemn Simulacrum, for example, in their Gruul Surprise deck, which is pretty sweet with the Cavalier, right? But the problem is like, if you're paying 4 mana for a 2/2 that gets you a land, like, you're in trouble. Like, especially in a world where, like, half of the things, and we'll get into this later, like, are going to exile that thing, and you're not even going to get the card out of it.
Yeah, I think this is like a pretty common misunderstanding from players. That is a fallacy that makes sense, like how people get there, but when you kind of talk about it, it makes more sense why it ends up being like not true. So you would think more cards in a card pool, right? Especially like an older format, more cards are legal. I'd be able to play more cards, right? Because I just have more cards. In reality, the bigger a card pool gets, it actually limits the number of cards that can see play because the bar for you must be like kind of this tall to ride the ride, like you must be this good, goes higher and higher and higher because you have more and more cards available to you. This is why formats like Modern and Legacy are sort of the way they are, right? And Standard increasing by both a year and now this extra set in Foundations, which is a very big set and has some of the best in class things, right? Like Burst Lightning is just the best red deal 2 damage spell we have. And you might want to play your 5th Burst Lightning, right? So you'll play like a Shock, for example, but it's going to just basically move things out of the class and really raise the power level. So cards like Solemn Simulacrum, that at one point in Magic's history were very real cards that were, part of Pro Tour winning decks, don't get close to the bar as much now, in part because just there are so many more cards to choose from. They get pushed out. And like you're mentioning, a lot of the removal right now, there's a lot of benefits to dying. In the world we live in, exile is kind of premium, and there's a lot of things that sort of give you half a card or a full card's worth of value if they die. So he's also having a bit of an issue with like just the metagame as a whole. If Foundations is legal for forever, maybe one day Solemn will have a home. But for right now, it is hard to play those kind of cards just because they don't impact the game, right? And they kind of don't do any of the things we talked about, right? It's not a meaningful action, right? It doesn't really help you snowball unless you were already ahead, right? And it doesn't break serve in any meaningful way. So it really kind of breaks those rules, and you can kind of see why we talk about these things, because knowing those things can be good guidelines for moving forward with your preparations for Standard.
Yeah, I want to talk about Flyers and you, and I want to talk about Pioneer really quick. So Pioneer broke Standard in a lot of ways, in that people figured out the Demons deck before the RC, and then it served into World Standard, and now there are 2 versions of every mid-range deck. There's a Demons version and a non-Demons version. And what was really interesting to yesterday, I was playing. I want to give them a shout out because I was playing a version of Mice that I'll talk about later in the day. But it was, I think his name is Blue Sky. Is so interesting that your stuff goes into replies, but it is Alan. I'm not going to get your last name wrong. It's on Juski, 2-time Worlds competitor, posted a free mouse deck list and guide on Blue Sky, and I was like, okay, I'm going to try this out. And one of the things that was interesting is the sideboard guide did not differentiate Golgari and Dimir Demons versus the non-Demons variants. And there are 4 Paw Patch, what is it? And
Paw Patch Formation.
Paw Patch Formation, thank you. In the sideboard. And I think that Paw Patch Formation is in a very interesting place in this format because of the number of flyers and enchantments that are seeing play. Between the Overlords, between the demons, between everything. And the other thing is like, there is a lot of flying in Standard. I in all honesty, I think there is the most flying in Standard I've ever seen. And I'm kind of curious, like, I don't have a rule for this, like, other than you better know that you're going to play against flyers.
Yeah, I think just saying the simple term of like flying is popular, I should say this: a lot of threats that have flying are popular. It's just an important part of things, and I do want to give a small note that like Dimir Demons is like significantly less popular than Dimir Midrange.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Like it's basically not a deck anymore. But like Golgari does have those differentials. And you will just see a lot of flyers because a lot of the flyers are some of the more push cards. Like I think Fairy Mastermind just lines up pretty well with a lot of what people are doing and is a very strong on rate card that pushes players in that direction. And then in general, right, cards like Kaito rewards you for having evasion. So while there are some pretty good cards you could be playing in these decks that are not flyers, and I've seen people bring them up to me in coaching and they ask, why is someone playing this? The answer I always give them is, well, you're a Kaito deck. You're an Enduring Curiosity deck.
Yeah.
If you just have the evasion, you go so much further. So that has some really weird implications on Standard as well, where there's other factors pushing you to go in the sky as well, right? If you're playing against like Glissa or a Screaming Nemesis, you don't want to be on the ground with your thing, right? Those things are going to punish you. So there's a lot of different factors that are pushing you towards the sky. Carrot Cake, right? What an annoying thing to work through if you're like, I played a lot of Sentinel the Nameless City, and Carrot Cake is like just basically Ancestral Recall against me. It's like block 2 turns, draw a card or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, you got me there. But jokes aside, there's just a lot of that going on, and that puts you in a really, really weird spot.
Yeah, I will say, my win percentage against the non-demons version is much higher. Jace plus Extractor Demon has beaten me more than most things in this format. So
I wonder if that's a symptom of decks, but also that you don't have
I play everything now, man. Like I've
just seen some of the decks the ones you've been sharing, and I do think that like those look pretty well positioned against more mid-rangey stuff. Because I think Dimir Demons, when you play against it, is much more of a controlling deck.
It is, yeah.
Right? And so, like, it is like a fundamentally different thing. And like having a good amount of spot removal, which I think a good thing you typically do in deck building is play like one too many spot removal spells sometimes, like, which is a good thing to have.
You're
right?
Like the thing that you do really well, Spencer, is you play one too many of this thing.
No, but I think like it's better, like similar to Lance.
It's
right?
it's the Willie Adel rule of deck building.
Yeah, like the idea of beating aggro first. Yeah, I think like that is a really good thing to do, and with a lot of the format being creature focused right now, that's really rewarding, right? And so, but then when you play against less creatures, that's going to have like an inverse effect, because I was also having the exact same experience for a bit where I couldn't lose to Dimir midrange, but I kept losing to Dimir Demons early in Foundations. And I realized it was because like, I don't have the tools to fight this. I'm thinking of them as the same deck, but they're fundamentally different.
They're very different.
Exactly.
We already talked about Death and Exile really quick, but I just want to highlight it before we move on. That like the fact that, I mean, we saw this at Worlds where people were just like, no, I'm just gonna like anoint stuff instead, to the point where like they are willing to sacrifice the mana impact that we talked about earlier to just exile stuff. And I think it was last week we saw, I don't remember if it was Golgari or if it was Dimir, but one of them was playing stabs in the main over cut downs, and they had cut downs in the sideboard. And like it really does talk about like not just Heartfire Hero, but like the importance of like, you know, lowering like power and toughness in some ways. And I had a game where I made a really sweet play to do something similar, where like I lowered a power and toughness with a virtue, and it really does go to show like the creatures are really powerful, and you know, Fumigate's in Standard now, and I think that Sunfall will still outclass it, even though like Fumigate's crazy powerful. It's a 5 mana like Wrath, just because exiling is so important.
Yeah, I mean, even like Fumigate's a like kind of a gold standard for 5 mana ones. I'd argue Sunfall's supplanted it now, but before this, it was the best 5 mana Wrath. We even have Day of Judgment, right? Like we have a mana less, and in formats like this, we're talking about snowballing, a turn sooner, especially because, you know, at least half your games you're going to be on the draw, right? Even if you're 2-0ing everyone, you're going to be on the draw half of them. You need to be able to catch up from behind, and we're still seeing players en masse choose to play a bunch of Sunfall and consider, okay, do I want some split ups?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that really matters. This actually leads me to a rule I'd love to add real quick that we didn't put down. I meant to put down, this is on me, but I want to talk about really quickly. decks that don't play by what we've talked about today. And I think there are three.
I wanted to talk about this at the end too.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead though.
So there are three decks. I think we could even talk about more, but there are three that jump out to me when we talk about this. So the first is the Temur Floodcaller deck. That's going to be the Sanctum of All Otter combo deck. There's the Zur deck that some people call Domain. I'm going to call it Zur here on the podcast just because there are some people playing Zur-less Domain decks, and I just don't want to differentiate this. So when I talk about Zur or Domain, I'm going to differentiate them. And then Mono White Control. Those are three, but there's also things like Convoke. There's lots of other like weirder things going on as well. But these are decks in the format, right? If you listen to this podcast and you listen with a sharp ear, you're going to notice that Mason Spencer alluded to like 4 or 5 decks the entire time. And they do make up a large swath of the format. I think we've talked about, in my opinion, the best decks in Standard. I think all these decks are great decks, easily could win like a GP or something. But I think, we covered a lot of the main ones earlier. There are things that are just completely saying like, yeah, there's all these amazing snowball threats. Yeah, there's a lot of one-mana cards that, run away with the game. Anyways, I'm a registered carrot cake. And like those decks are powerful and they are attacking you in a real way, and they will stretch your sideboard because they all go in very disparate directions. So,
well, I want to talk about. You actually mentioned multiple decks that do this thing that is really interesting. There are a lot of formats, and I might take some time to think about this. Mason, I would love your thoughts on this. A lot of the times in a given format, the format is either about going wide or going tall. This means that like you're either trying to stack stuff or you're trying to go out when you're playing an aggressive deck. There's a problem in this format that the best aggressive deck does both. And that is wild. And then you mentioned some decks that go wide. In, Jeskai, for example. I think that I played against the Doomwake deck yesterday that goes wide. The, blue-white poopies deck. And I just think that, what's interesting is that this is a format... You actually mentioned... I mean, you think about Temporary Lockdown, for example, as a card that, was a staple. And now it's like, do I even want this versus other things that I could play in this slot? And it's kind of interesting because I don't know. You have to prepare for your opponent to do either one. And you kind of have to decide what is important in the given game and situation, as we talked about earlier on the sequencing thing. The rule of engagement here is you have to prepare for wide and you have to prepare for tall. And if you don't, you're going to get beaten by one of them, depending on the deck.
I mean, the standard format's pretty deep, right? Like, you talked about the Azorius Convoke deck, like the Leyline Axe, Cheap to the Board, Zoetic Glyph, there's stuff like that. We're seeing, mono black decks pop up. People are experimenting with Azorius. I think people might be surprised to learn things like Eyeball have fallen down in, the rankings a little bit, but if you think about what we talked about today, it might make more sense why the Azorius Eyeball deck has kind of slipped away from kind of the top echelons of the format, just pre-Foundations to now. There's not much. I want to give one more example of a card that's breaking serve, because I thought of this one earlier. I think it's maybe important. And it's also a thing that kind of ties into a lot of what we're talking about today. And that's the card Shelter by Ghost. I think that's sort of one of the more underplayed cards right now in Standard. And Sheltered by Ghost, if you don't know, it's 1 to white for an aura where you exile a non-land permanent, and then you attach it to the creature. The creature gets Ward 2 and +1/+0 lifelink. And if the creature if the Shelter by Ghost leaves the battlefield, the thing returns. So it's a Banishing Light. And this is a really high impact card that impacts the board, right? It's a strong action. It stabilizes your life total. It's something that helps you snowball when you're ahead or catch up behind, and helps you push your advantage, and is very mana efficient, right? It is just very good at 2 mana for doing this. And then it also taxes your opponent and allows you to dodge things like flyers, right? If your deck doesn't have a ton of flyers, but you're able to maybe take their best one and give lifelink to your thing, that's a huge sort of thing. So that was a card that kind of, 1, I think is a little underplayed, and 2, kind of fits this idea really well. And I think if you look for things like that, you can really start to think about what your deck maybe needs in order to, catch up to the rest of the format.
Dude, I really love that you said that because I identify this as like that exact card. I don't know if I posted this in the Discord, but I have a Boros mouse deck that is like basically like this and the shield, like the enchantment stuff, because I just think that they do this really well. And
yeah,
like,
I don't know if you've seen. There's been some action with that online.
Oh, I have not seen it, but I did.
Yeah,
I've played it on Arena, and it's to some success. And like, I just think that like this format's very much not figured out, but you see the results, and also you see like why some people are pretty low on some decks. You know, whether it be the decks that we talked about, like why are people low on mono white and domain? Why are people low on different stuff? And it's interesting. There's a lot going on. Mason, what would you play based upon these rules?
I am, for right now, my plan for the Spotlight series is to play red something. It'll probably be mono red. I've been playing a lot of Gruul. Boros with like the Sheltered by Ghost stuff and the Shard is definitely on my radar. That's kind of the next thing I want to test. I want those, and then I've been trying out a lot of other things, but like very interested in the Caretaker's Talent deck, just from a positional stance of being good against red, but I fear it has the problem of good against red and not great against everything else. So trying to figure out how to take those aspects of Caretakers that are good and apply them to other control decks. Been hard so far, to say the least, but that's kind of where I'm at when it comes to things. But I also think Dimir is something I could easily see myself switching to at the last minute and just being like, yeah, Kaito is so strong. I'm just going to have good sideboard plants and jam. So, what about you, Spencer?
Yeah, I was like pretty high on Screaming Nemesis like 3 days ago. And now I think the format has been like, okay, we need to allow that Screaming Nemesis beat us up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I like we were talking about decks for RCQ seasons and like, getting cards together and stuff. And right now, if I was to play something tomorrow, I would play Gruul Mice. No Slick Shots.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the deck does that go tall, go wide thing really, really well. But I think the most fun decks in Standard that I would enjoy playing are that also follow the rules, for what it's worth, in my opinion. Are green-red Surprise. I think that deck is weirdly good at following the rules for a deck that like is like a ramp combo deck. It's a very weird deck, but it follows the rules really well. And I also think that there are like lots of ways to build it. I started playing against it recently. I feel like I've never played against it, and I'm always the one playing it. But I played against it 3 times this week to various different builds, which is interesting. And then the other one is like the Tolarian Tear deck. That deck gets to play the Action Economy game, and also somehow every single card has like 5 modes in that deck. Yeah, I mean, I've only played it a little bit. Like, I think I'm like less than 5 matches in with that deck, but I think I like it better than Otters, and I think that it follows all of the rules really well. So, but yeah, I'd play Mice. Every week on the show, we like to give a shout out to our patrons. Their newest one is Davis. Shout out to Davis. Thank you so much for becoming a patron of the show. If you want to become a patron, head over to patreon.com/ccmtg. We try to make the show free for everybody, do everything that we can. But yeah, if you become a patron of $5 or more, you get access to early access. I'll be posting this one. We didn't do live this week because we had some technical difficulties, but I'll be posting this right after we're done for early access, and then editing it. But thank you to Davis. And then if you are at that level, you also get access to the Patreon question, Mason. Why don't you go ahead and read our Patreon question this week?
Yeah, this one comes from Cole, and it said, I qualified for RC Portland. I'm not sure how to spend my time preparing before the upcoming BNR. For those out of the loop, this is a modern RC. How would you spend your prep time for events in situations like this? Well, Cole, this has been a question that's come up a lot in coaching, so I have a pretty rehearsed answer I'll give you. The answer that I have right now is this format is either going to be dramatically shaken up or not at all, right? If they ban the One Ring, it is going to fundamentally change what Modern is, and it's going to have dramatic impacts. And the best thing that you can do right now is spend your time playing decks in Modern that look pretty interesting to you that you don't know much about. That way, and specifically decks that do not use the One Ring. So that way, if a banning happens, you can immediately be like, okay, I know a little bit about this deck from before. A good example of this might be like Hardened Scales or the Rakdos FOMO, kind of Death Shadowy decks we're seeing run around a little bit to middling success, Yawgmoth is another deck that's a good example. This Living End's another good example. Learn about these sort of decks. Pick one that maybe you're not even likely to play, but you just don't understand a lot. Learn a lot about it. That way, if the One Ring gets banned, you're going to be able to sort of then be like, okay, I know a little about these. Maybe I want to play them, maybe I don't, but now I understand them better. And then when the RC happens, hopefully you have a bit more understanding. You can also spend this time just to work on fundamentals. But if you're wanting to actually play Modern and get something out of it, your best bet is to try to play things that you don't understand a lot about now, so your understanding gets higher, so that when the One Ring is banned, you will be, in that position. I'm hopeful they're banned a little more, but that's the case. And then if they don't ban the One Ring, then we'll probably be in sort of a very similar format to now, but that's okay. It's very well explored, and you can catch up to speed playing whichever version of energy or combo deck you would like to play. So that is my answer. Spencer, what about yourself?
I really like your answer. So I'm going to deviate a little bit and say one of three things is going to happen. The first thing is that they will only ban the One Ring. I think that this is the least likely outcome, but it is possible. Here's the reason I think it's the least likely. If we look at archetypes, yes, every deck plays the One Ring. But if you only ban the One Ring, I don't think it hurts the best deck. In fact, I think it helps the best deck. I think that if you only ban the One Ring, they can play Fable of the Mirror Breaker. They can play basically anything they want in that slot. And I mean, some of them don't even only play 2 One Rings anyway. And I just don't think it does anything. The second most likely is that some combination of energy cards and the One Ring get banned. I think this is the most likely scenario. And also the one that changes the format fundamentally again, where I think that Mason's advice is exactly what you need to do, which is okay, if energy cards, whether it be Guide of Souls, whether it be Raptor, whether it be both, and the One Ring get banned, okay, now Tron changes, now Amulet changes, now Ramp changes, Eldrazi Ramp changes, now everything changes, in addition to this deck suddenly not existing that is super dominant. The last thing that could happen is that they don't ban the One Ring, and they just ban the energy cards. That also changes the format in a significant way. And I think it's the second least likely. I can see them doing it, I think that they won't just ban the One Ring, but I think that Mason's advice is really good. And the other thing that he said that kind of got hidden out of there is just practice fundamentals. Focus on good mulligan decisions. Focus on, building a good mana base. Focus on those things that, no matter what happens between those three options, leads you to a future of success. I think that that's what I would suggest. I'm qualified for Portland. I don't really see a reason to care too much about Modern before we know what happens. But like, maybe Rhinos or Domain become really good again all of a sudden. Who knows? So
Yeah, for what it's worth, I do think just the One Ring and Raptor are going to get banned. That's my guess. Like, those are the two cards that I think cause the most problems. And then if the energy deck stays good, then you can just ban Flage, and that probably removes all of its staying power. So,
yeah, I've seen people say the One Ring inflation. I'm like, is that the answer?
yeah, I think the One Ring is a design mistake. I think Flage was just very handsomely designed and just a little
Do
too
you?
small.
Do you think
Yeah.
that?
I actually just don't even know if Flage is that. Flage is strong. It's subsidized a lot right now by energy getting to like kind of have everything and then being kind of the best card in the energy mirror, where it was sort of designed to be. Well, the place was kind of like it will end up in controlling decks as the win condition. And I think if you ban the One Ring, there's a worry that like decks that interact might lose their edge because they've been kind of keeping up due to the One Ring, which is why I think if the One Ring was banned, there'd be such a cascading thing. But I think if you just ban the ring, you can have decks that go back to interacting on normal scales because card advantage matters again, right? And right now, card advantage doesn't matter, which is why you see combo decks and like, ring interactive decks. And those are like the two things you see. Like one of the showcases the Mox qualifier this past weekend had no energy in the top 8. It was 8 combo decks.
Yeah.
You can beat energy, but you have to be a combo deck.
Yeah, and we talked about that at the end of the last. I said, but you don't know how Flage was designed. You have no idea, Mason. You don't know what it's for. You have no context at all. Just none.
Yeah, I don't know Guided Souls either, or Vexing Bauble, or any of those cards. In fact, you should not be mad at Mason for any of those cards.
Yeah, you should not. That is going to do it for a Patreon question. You can head on over to our sponsor, Untap.gg. It is the perfect time to sign up because it is standard season. It's the best deck tracker on Arena. We all migrate during standard season. It's a little sad. Today, one of my best friends was like, "Yeah, I'm like doing this on Arena," and Matt Kling was like, "You play on Arena now?" I was like, "Did you buy all the world's decks to build your Arena collection because you haven't played in X years?" And they're like, "Yeah, I did. It seemed like a good deal." But if you need a deck tracker, Untap.gg is the best, and they have some of the best features for limited and constructed. Check them out. Use the link in the show notes. And then don't forget to head on over to the Swag Store. Everything that you buy does give a kickback. I officially need to buy the desk pad because I had to switch out playmats. I've got some top 16 or top 8 playmats from RC or PPTQ seasons for RCQs. I don't remember what they're called anymore.
They're RPTQs.
RPTQs, thank you. And then I've got like pro PTQ playmats like that are dying, and I want to save them to like kind of remember a little bit of stuff. So I officially need to get that CCMTG desk mat. So check it out. Let's talk about how I was improving though. I was improving is the point of the podcast. Every week on the show, we try to talk about things that we've been doing to improve lately. Mason, I'm gonna go first. I was winning a ton in Standard. I was winning with Gruul. I was winning with Surprise. I was winning with Dimir. I was winning with just everything. And all of a sudden, I was like 2-14, like just like a hard shift. And one of the things that I kind of sat there and I was talking to some of my teammates, and I was like, I think I need to just do something that I know or that I see that is someone else is having success with, to find my footing again. Like, okay, I'm going to do what somebody else is doing that they're winning with and just find my footing. And it was a total flip where I go from 2-14 in like a ton of matches to, okay, now I can't lose again. And I think the thing that is important here is like, I didn't let, whether it be variance or whether it be bad deck building, whatever it was, upset me. It was like, okay, I clearly have lost something in the sauce, and I need to find where that thing is lost, and I need to find to grapple with something to understand the format, to then build upon again. Like you're falling down a hill, and you need to grab onto something to stop the tumble. And it was really successful, and I think that it goes to show both the ways that I've gained. Instead of like, oh, I suddenly hate this format, it's like, no, I don't hate this format. I think this format's really fun. What can I do to understand the format again, or get to a place of understanding again? And I encourage people to not hate a format because you're losing, but instead find a way to grasp something that you understand to build upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I like what you kind of said there at the end about like when you're losing, like starting hating a format. I think it's very like, it's funny. I think it's very juvenile and very common for people to lose and be like, God, I don't like this format. And then I'll ask them, like, why do you not like this format? And they go, I'm losing. And I go, oh, do you play Magic to like win or whatever? You know? And I think that like when you play Magic in that way, it's very unsatisfying, right? I think it's a very like, I don't want to say sad way to engage with the game, but that's like the word that jumps out to me. And I think it's something where, you know, when you're having moments of losing, you should really like look inward and be like, what am I doing that I can help change like these sort of factors? There are some games you're just going to lose. There's nothing you can do. And in a larger majority of your games than that, you're going to have a lot of things you could do. And, you know, sometimes that's playing a better deck. Sometimes that's sideboarding better, right? Sometimes that's listening to others and trying out their stuff, right? Like kind of like what Spencer was doing there a bit. And that will lead to a huge, huge game. So I really like that always improving.
Where are you, man?
So my always improving moment comes from sort of just like the act of improving in League. So I've talked a little bit about it. I've been playing more League of Legends, and I found, and I mentioned them a little bit last week on the podcast. I had some of you reach out to me saying, you know, Kirch Curtis. So maybe through the grapevine, you could tell Kirch Curtis that, you know, we here on CC are just the MTG version of them, but we were here first. By about 300 episodes. But no, jokes aside, I had someone say, like, did y'all actually model your show off them? And I was like, no, they started like 2 years ago. We've been around about a decade. Which I thought was pretty funny.
The number of times that people have like messaged me, they're like, "Oh, did you know that there's this version of your show here?" I'm like, "Cool. We've been here for like 11 years, so
yeah, yeah." Anyway, so the improving moment though comes from this idea about, they call it champ mastery, which basically is the idea of like playing one character a lot and really understanding them. And I think it's an interesting thing because I think about it in the context of Magic, where it isn't as needed, because while there's still a lot of variance in both of our games, the variance is very different, right? In Magic, you don't have other people who are negatively affecting how your game goes, right? You don't have teammates who are causing things to happen, where in, you know, League, that is something that does occur. And so I was thinking about, like, should I be kind of doing this? And what I realized is what's more important than this is actually getting to the point where you feel like you actually understand what matters in these sort of games. Because when I was listening to him talk more, it was less about the actual number of raw games. There's some amount of like he feels that way, but also really it's like understanding what you can do in different scenarios. And that really led to me going to like play decks until I feel like I can answer a bunch of very specific questions. So those questions would be like, how do you engage with sort of the top 5 decks? So like in my mind, that would be like the red variants, the black mid-range variants, the Flood Caller deck, that kind of stuff. My next question was like, what is good about your deck and what is bad about your deck, right? Like acknowledging both those things because every deck has, pros and cons to it. And then finally, sort of like, what are the conditions that make you want to play a deck like this? And those are the things I've really been focusing on. And I've been doing like a lighter, less concrete version of this for a long time in Magic, especially as I've switched over to full-time coaching, needing to understand sort of the metagame at large is important. But getting it down to sort of more like a system and a thing I can easily replicate and sort of teach to others, I think was sort of a long-term, very huge, always improving moment for me. So that was mine.
Dude, I love that. You actually said something that I think that, Magic players, we're in an interesting position. Our game is really expensive. And I want to, we don't often call that out on this podcast. And I think sometimes it's like a little unfair to people. But you mentioned like, what would make me want to play this deck? Like, what are the situations that do that? And I hope that this episode actually highlights that for people. Where like, we gave you some rules that you have to follow, things that you have to think about. And in a lot of ways, it is about, finding opportunities where things are good. Mason, you talked about a deck that you talked about potentially being on something like mono white, for example, on this episode. Mm-hmm. And it's like, man, the number of times where Mason has poo-pooed on mono white on this podcast is so many. Why did he suddenly say that? And it's like, okay, well, what did we talk about in this episode that might make Mason change his tune? I think that you both and I had like this sharp turn on rhinos that we both got messages about when we did it in Modern. Mm-hmm. People were like, wait, you two both were like the biggest rhino haters in all of Magic. Why did Mason and Spencer suddenly switch? And it's like, rhinos got good.
Yeah, things change.
Fun fact.
And I think that's a big thing to note too. Is like, and I like you were mentioning though, right? Like the why. It's like, why do I think Rhinos was not good for like 2 years in Modern where it was doing fine? It's because like, yeah, I didn't think it was a top deck because a lot of the best decks had cards that lined up well against the Rhinos, and like there were good answers, and it was very easy to fight these fights.
And as didn't matter, and suddenly,
yeah, exactly. And as the card pool changes and what people are playing changes, that moves it. And you're listened to, right? Like if you listen to me talk about mono white there, I even mentioned I think it's underpowered in some of the other spots, but I really love its red positioning.
Yeah.
Right. And that gives you a hint to kind of what my answer is to mono white, where it's like, well, if Mason's, I should say caretaker control, because I've also experimented a lot with splashing. But like, it's like, okay, if I'm going to play this deck, it's because I think that I'm going to play against mono red realistically 5 of my 15 rounds, and I've got my other matchups fine enough that I can like convert, but otherwise I'm not going to play the deck because it's like slow and clunky and has a lot of structural issues. But I can acknowledge when those things are good. I think there's also something that like, this is worth talking about really quick here, Spencer. Sorry to take this back.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm the one that opened it up. So
yeah, but I think one thing that sometimes people forget, and I mention this a lot in coaching, is that when, at least personally, when I do the podcast, I am talking to a lot of you at varying skill levels. I have only a certain amount of time to talk, and I need to convey what I believe to be the most helpful thing to the widest amount of audience. So I need to speak in generalities a lot more. I need to be kind of taking like stronger stances with a big brush and give my quick caveats on like why I might be different. Hope that the experienced player can read between the lines there, and hope the less experienced player takes that as a big moment, right? And they're like, oh, this means something, and that's something they can latch onto and with time learn from. But I can't get into the nitty-gritty like I do in coaching, because, or I might do on like a stream when talking about something, because I just can't sit here and talk about that for 15 minutes for every deck. We talked about like 6 or 7 different decks in passing. That would be the whole podcast time if I just did that. And that's what I normally would need to do. So.
Yeah, I really don't want every podcast to be like 2 to 3 hours. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. This also wouldn't be helpful, I think. Yeah. Honestly.
I think first of all, nobody would listen. Like,
yeah. I am curious how often people act like that's kind of what they want. But I wonder how much they want that, or like, the idea of wanting that. it's interesting.
Yeah. You can join the conversation by joining the Patreon Discord, patreon.com/ccmg, $5 or more. The public Discord is a great place to, really early on in the format, like limited stuff goes on there, but like the public Discord for all of He's a Game Media is available as well. And then the YouTube comments. Well, y'all started slacking when we stopped reading them. You guys got to get back on there. Help us out. No, just kidding. We actually got some really nice YouTube comments the last couple of weeks. Just like, people are loving kind of the shift that we have had, Mason, since our last meeting of like focusing on specific formats, specific topics, and the way that we're doing things. And I really appreciate it. So thank you so much for those kind of YouTube comments. And then whether it's Twitter or Blue Sky or Threads, you can find the podcast. Just look for CCMG or Constructive Criticism. We're there. We're doing stuff. As far as I'm going to make a change to how we do the TikToks, and I want to talk about it really quickly on here. With me editing the TikTok, we will not do we will do some clips of the show, but I will be recording a TikTok before every episode is posted, talking about what is this week's episode about and what is the big takeaway, rather than a clip of Mason or me or Abe talking. And it will have a link to the show in it, and it will happen after the show is posted rather than before. So, just really quick, wanted to mention that. Yeah. Mason, where can people find you?
You can find me over on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/DMasonClark. You can find me on coverage for literally every weekend except for the Christmas one coming up this year. I'll be doing the NXP. I'm going to be doing that with Will Hall and Niall. So I'll be on I'll be on Saturday and Sunday, morning Saturday, top 8 on Sunday, I believe. So make sure to check that out. Honor Alex putting on that event. So it's going to be really awesome to see how that goes. Will Hall and I are also doing kind of a modern breakdown and expectations going to the BNR. You can also see me in NRG Champs. That's going to be in 2 weeks from now. I really like to hype up that one. I normally don't go into details about NRG as much because I do all their stuff, but Champs is coming up. It's going to be super awesome. 26 players. Are you doing
coverage for that, or are you playing in that?
I'm doing coverage.
Got it.
So I'm going to be covering that one. I don't know exactly what rounds that hasn't been figured out yet, but you can check that out. And there's going to be lots of action for all the 3 major formats. And then you can also check me out on Jaffer, the Twitch streamer. He's having me on to commentate his sort of release of Pioneer Master. So lots of Mason commentary for the next 3 weeks if you're interested on that. And if you want to play in Jaffer's tournament, it's a free Pioneer tournament on Arena with prizes. It's pretty cool. So you can check that out on his Twitter at JafferTTV, but basically free to enter December 21st. It's going to be full Pioneers on Arena. I think they said they're at 99% completion once the set comes out for being 1-to-1. So, and with Ben White's leading the set, I have a lot of faith that we're not going to miss anything. It's going to be 2 mana 1/1 or whatever from a draft set. That's what we're going to be missing, So for the most part, it's going to be good. It's going to be exciting to see sort of how that all goes. And if you want to reach out to me, a week from now, So pretty soon you can check that out on the Arena page, but that'll be fun. And you can reach out to me for coaching on Twitter at Mason E. Clark, or you can email me about coaching, masoneclark@gmail.com, and put coaching in the description. That way I know you're there. I'm starting to get filled up a little bit as we get closer to the Spotlight Series, but I've still got a decent number of spots available, so you want to get in there sooner than later. Spencer, where can people find you?
You can find me at Spencer30H on Blue Sky, at He's a Game on Twitter, and you can reach out to me. You can find me every week, for the most part, on the Need to Nerd podcast, where we talk about nerd stuff. This week I have to edit the Witcher Season 3 episode. Witcher Season 4 has been confirmed, and I'm really excited about it. I am opening up coaching again. You can just email me at spencerhowland@gmail.com. My preferred coaching, because I like to talk about this, is I like coaching teams on how to work together, build better teams, their process, things like that. That's my number one. But I also do individual coaching for people in the beginner to intermediate level on building a process and things like that. So very process oriented. You can find Abe at More Nothings both on Twitter and Blue Sky. I know that Abe has moved towards Blue Sky and is is doing stuff there. I think he's finishing his music stuff on Twitter and then kind of dipping out. You can find and then you can find the podcast everywhere, whether it be Spotify, Apple, whatever. But I wanted to mention on this show, and I will try to find a way to do this. If you have a friend that's like, oh, I can't listen to CCMTG anymore, it disappeared, that the network feed that originally had all of the shows for the website no longer exists. If you're listening to this, you have a friend that feels like they've lost the show, they probably just are on the wrong feed. And to let them know, like just look for constructive criticism, you'll find it again. Thank you everybody so much. Mason, I love you. It was fun. It was a good episode.
It was a good time. We'll see y'all next week. Another CCMTG.